Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Midnight Sun Flycasters February meeting. And today we have Andy Gryska from Fish and Game talking about Minto Flats Whitefish and Chatanika Whitefish. And I'm just going to go through a few announcements for the club before we hand things over to Andy for his talk. All right, so if you're not familiar with our club, I think most everybody here is, but the Midnight Sun Flycasters were established in 1976, and it's kind of interior Alaska's fly fishing group that fosters kind of learning skills, fly fishing, fish conservation, habitat conservation in interior Alaska. Kind of our big events for the year typically are the kids camp, where kids aged 10 through 16 go to the Lost Lake Boy Scout camp and learn kind of all aspects of fly fishing with their parent and guardian. And we are putting that on in 2022. I'll talk a little bit more about that before we hand things off to Andy. And, you know, we often do fly tying events. We've adopted a section of the Chena Hot Springs Road up near mile 45 for litter pickup. And so just kind of various things that the club does in the community to build our fly fishing community here in interior Alaska. If you haven't checked out our social media and website, the links are there. Definitely give those a look. And just a couple brief announcements before I hand things to Andy. So we just put in some fishing regulations proposals. If you guys didn't check those out and vote on them, it was for kind of clarifying burbot set line regulations. I think myself and a couple other Flycasters members have often seen folks keeping pike on their burbot lines, and the regulations weren't super clear for folks about how that's supposed to go. So we put in a proposal to kind of just clarify that pike are not supposed to be retained on burbot lines, because we do see a lot of confusion with that. And we also put in one for kind of keeping salmon wet, you know, with our Yukon and Tanana River coho, chum, and Chinook salmon runs doing poorly. Just trying to do what we can in the sport fishing community to minimize stress on those fish if we ever get to fish for them again. There's been a lot of closures in the last few years. So
last time.
And so our next meeting should be in March. I'm going to actually be in South America until March 12th, so we kind of pushed it a little bit, but we should have something in March. And we don't have a speaker yet, but I'll send out some information in the next couple of weeks about who we're going to have. And then we decided not to have a banquet this year, just with COVID and with me being gone in March as well. And like I said, kids camp is going to happen June 10th through 12th at Lost Lake Boy Scout camp. The registration is now open, but we do have a lot of kind of caveats with COVID. Our kind of core group of volunteers has asked that everybody that participates in the camp be vaccinated, just because, you know, those folks are a little older and they're just worried about their health, and I think that's fair enough. So that camp will happen and the registration's open. And then we still have our online membership option. If you haven't signed up with the club or renewed your membership, check out our website and definitely renew that there. All the money goes to kids camp and other club activities. We're a nonprofit club, so that all goes to a pretty good spot. And so just introducing our presenter today, Andy Gryska, from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Andy's the Fairbanks area management biologist, so he weighs in on a lot of the decisions about sport fishing regulations and fish population status and this sort of thing. And of course, he's got a huge research background as well, particularly with Arctic grayling, like we were talking about a little bit. He's studied grayling on the Delta River, the Nenana, pretty much all over the interior, right? The Delta Clearwater, the Goodpaster River. So a huge breadth of knowledge there on grayling, and he's done a lot of great whitefish work, including what he's going to talk about today, Minto Flats whitefish, broad whitefish, humpback whitefish, that sort of thing. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Andy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get his slides going here. So thanks for coming, Andy.
All right, thank you. All right, is that coming through?
Yeah, that looks good.
All right. Oh, good. Is my mouse coming through on that too? The cursor?
Yep, I can see that moving around.
All right, good. All right, so yeah, Kevin asked me to talk about Minto Flats whitefish a little while ago, and I thought I was going to have a little more time, but I was my trip was delayed a little bit this January, so kind of got back with really a short amount of time to try to put this together on a kind of wide ranging subject. So it's kind of generalized. It's probably more open for probably more just to stimulate some questions or thoughts from you all rather than a tight presentation. So hope this works out. Let's see here. Let me see if I can get these buttons to work.
You might have to just click on your slide and then you should be able to advance from there.
Oops. Yep. There went one. Hopefully that was it. Is that number 2? No. Sorry. I'm going the wrong way. How do I get back to the start here?
You should be able to use like your arrows on your computer, the left arrow to go back.
There we go. Good. Minto Flats. All right. Generally, the Minto Flats is where my cursor, hopefully you can see my cursor spinning around here, Minto Village, and it's where the Tolovana, Chatanika River come in and Goldstream Creek. And then they all come together and travel down here through the west edge of the flats and into the Chatanika River. It's quite a lot of water running into a flat basin. It's a lot of lakes and interconnected streams, and it's quite productive. It's kind of, I don't know, I think it's great to go down there when you travel from some areas, especially when you travel on the highway over to Minto Village and then you drop down and go into the lake. It seems like you go from the hungriest country you can find to really the most productive area you can see in the interior. So it's a pretty neat area. So that's the area. Kevin wanted me to talk about the whitefish. I didn't have a great picture of all the fish together, but Randy Brown had a nice one. Other than this Bering Cisco that's sitting right here, that one does not belong, but all the others do. So we have a round whitefish, a leaf Cisco, humpback whitefish, a broad whitefish, and sheefish. You can find all these in the flats at various times. So I just thought we'd just kind of run through the species and a little bit of information that we have about them from radio tagging. This is a sheefish caught down in the lower Tolovana in the flats area before it hits the Chatanika. In general, they become mature around 60 centimeters, 24 inches, age 6 or 7. Some of them do skip spawn. That is, once they become mature, they do. Some will, a few individuals will spawn each year consecutively, but some individuals, for whatever reason, if they don't accumulate enough energy stores, they won't spawn the following year. Again, these are kind of generalities in terms of size and age, but I'm sure you can find examples would be slightly different. Longevity, 20 to 40 years they've been found to live. At least in the Chatanika, they seem to max out around 3 feet long or 90 centimeters. Some anadromy has been detected in them through analyzing the ear bones. Thank you, Randy. Primarily, they eat fish. We tagged a number of sheefish in the Chatanika drainage, about 2010, I think. And we tagged some of them up here where the Tolovana and Chatanika come together.
Hey, I'm sorry. You said some anadromy? Anadromy, does that mean they go there's some of them that actually go the whole way to the ocean?
Yes.
From Minto?
Yeah, and I think,
Wow. Okay.
yeah,
Thanks.
well, a lot of juvenile whitefishes, I mean, when they're first larval fish and they come up from the gravels, they go downriver, and some end up down in the estuaries, and they pick up. But they found it looking at some of these ear bones on some of these fish. Some individuals have an indication of strontium, which is in seawater, but not in freshwater, unless the basin of the freshwater has a lot of strontium. The this drainage doesn't have strontium to any degree. So there's kind of an evident mark on these ear bones. So some of the fish that have been sampled in the Chatanika River, sheefish, the broad whitefish, and humpbacks Randy found some bones that had strontium. Now, not every fish does this, but and exactly which time period they did it, but a lot of them are in their younger ages when they end up washing down river. So, yeah. What was I going to say? Did that answer your question first off before I move on?
Yeah, that was it.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Just wanted to point out where we tagged these fish. We caught some of these fish here in the Minto Flats around the Tolovana and Chatanika, and then down on the lower Tolovana where Swaneck Slough comes in. We also tagged some down here at the Zitsiana and the Kosna, Chatanika. We tagged those in mostly in May and June, a little bit in July. And what we're trying to find is if some of these fish spawn, where they spawn in the Chatanika drainage or otherwise other areas. I think we had about 40 to 60 tags. I can't quite recall off the top of my head. I don't have the exact numbers in these locations. What I do know is I have a couple different things to point out here. One is this is the fish end up coming by Fairbanks here, and a lot of them spawn up here in this. It's a whitefish. We know now it's a fairly large whitefish spawning area. It's basically from the Fairbanks dump, you know where that is, all the way up to about Moose Creek Dam. And maybe a little upstream of Moose Creek Dam, but not by much. But that's kind of the general area where they're spawning. A lot of people have known they spawn up here in the Chatanika River in the usual whitefish spearing area right there at the Elliott Highway Bridge. We also had, and I know this, I can't remember which individual this was. I don't think it was from, the ones that we tagged in the flats. I think every fish went up to the Chatanika River, except for one went up into the Tanana spawning area. One of these other fishes down here ended up here in the Salukna sheefish spawning area. This is probably this would be more similar to what the Chatanika is like. And we also had several individuals go up here into the Yukon Flats spawning area. And the Yukon Flats spawning area is going to be more similar to like the Tanana. So I'll move on to broad whitefish. Maturity at around age 6 and are roughly 18 inches. Some of them also skip spawn. They can live quite long, 20 to 30 years. I think there's been a few ages, maybe even older than that, but gives you an expectation that they live fairly long. Max size, about 28 inches or so. Again, some evidence of anadromy in some individuals. They primarily eat benthic invertebrates, mollusks and crustaceans and insects and such. We did tag, sorry, I can't remember the numbers, but just say, somewhere on the order of like 60 or so broad whitefish. We tagged some when we tagged here in the Tanana spawning area in the fall. About half the tags we put out here in this area here in the fall time. In the springtime, we tagged about the other half of the tags we tagged here in the Minto Flats area. And we're just trying to see seasonally where they went for. So for example, the ones in the Minto Flats seasonally, well, we know they're going to be in here in the summer for a bit because we tagged them in mid-May. We want to see where they go to spawn and then where they went to overwinter and if they return back to Minto Flats. And essentially the same questions here at the Tanana spawning area of, where these fish ended up overwintering, where they ended up spending the summer, and where they returned to spawn. So these are spawning locations, and or I shouldn't say spawning, some of them are spawning locations. It's really where they were found in the fall time. And these numbers are actually like 69 here. That's an 81, 73. These are just the codes for these fish. So there might be, so for example, here's this orange here is 2015. You'll see number 69 was over here in 2015 during the spawning time. And then in 2016, it was up here in the Tana spawning area. So it was it skipped, it did not spawn in 2015, but it did spawn in 2016. That's the presumption without actually holding the fish. That's based on the locations. Anyways, to point this out basically is that some fish that if they're not spawning, they tend to be downstream of Nenana and still in the flats. If they were going to spawn, they were, you know, either in transit like number 11 here or all the way up here into the spawning areas. But these were identified as fish spawning here in this Chatanika River spawning area. We had one individual go up to the Chatanika, up to the Elliott Highway Bridge. And all the sampling that we've done there for other whitefishes, I tried to talk to a couple of individuals that have worked here a long time and did some other projects there a long time ago, and they report maybe seeing 1 or 2 broad whitefish in all the time that we sampled there. So that was highly unusual. This particular fish was the smallest broad whitefish we had, and so it probably was the youngest. Maybe it was the first time it was spawning. Maybe it just decided to follow the humpback whitefish up there for some reason. I just think it's kind of an anomaly. I don't think there are any broad whitefish up there spawning. We did 2 years ago when sampling for some humpback whitefish there. We did run into another small broad whitefish up there at the in the fall time. So all I can think of is that, they make a mistake and go the wrong direction. Anyways, so I discount that as a spawning area. We had, I think, I don't know, my controls are over the top here, but I think we ended up with 3 fish up here in the Yukon Flats spawning area. And then also this individual here, which I'm not sure if it was, I think the problem with this particular fish was we couldn't get a flight in one of the Octobers, and I think we found this particular fish in a February flight, and they tend to overwinter downstream of the spawning area, so it's suspected that this may have been a spawner, and by spawning up here in the Yukon Flats, and then it went downstream and overwintered here. I should point out there's one interesting individual, and I can't fathom what was going on. The individual left the Minto Flats area, and it was detected up here in the Tana spawning area in October. And I think one of the winter flights, it was picked up somewhere over here in the Yukon. It was just so bizarre. I went through the data set several times. It got multiple detections in both locations. I don't know if it came up here and didn't want to spawn here, made a mistake and turned around and came back up into the Yukon Flats area, or it spawned in both areas. I have who knows, but it was highly unusual. And I feel pretty darn confident that this fish was detected properly by the radio receiver, but that's a highly unusual. I'm just throwing that out as an anecdote that was highly unusual. Okay, from spawning, we'll go to locations of spawners and non-spawners, radio tagged broad whitefish during September. So the non-spawners, I counted them as non-spawners, and because they did not proceed upstream in Nenana during the fall time, and I placed them all in yellow color. And the point is here in September is that a few of them came out of the Minto Flats and they overwintered or they're beginning to get set up in their overwintering areas, but some other individuals are taking their time. And this is, I think the flight was around September 28th or 30th. And at the same time, we have these other individuals that have already left Minto Flats, and they're clearly on their way up to the Fairbanks spawning area. And this relates to the winter habitat too. Again, I have the non-spawners basically overwintered. They've vacated the Minto Flats, and they're overwintering here in the lower Tanana, downstream of Nenana. The brown colored ones were the ones that ended up coming up into the Fairbanks area to spawn, and then largely kind of went downstream of the general spawning area a little bit, and then just overwintered near Fairbanks and just downstream of Fairbanks. And then a few of the other ones trickled all the way down here to Nenana, and then an individual here below Nenana and one near the Kantishna. But anyways, I just found a slight difference in where these spawners and non-spawners would occupy for winter habitat, as well as when they departed the Minto Flats in the fall time. These ciscos, they're mature at about age 3 to 5, at about 10, 12 inches, somewhere right around there. Their longevity, they've 10 to 20 years. Some of them measured a little bit older than that in other areas. They max out around 18 inches. I don't know of any anadromy for this particular species in the Minto Flats area. I have never taken their air bones and checked them, so I'm not sure if Randy ever did or not. I'm just not quite sure, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But they primarily eat zooplankton. We did a radiotelemetry study just recently on them, and it's very similar to the broad whitefish study in that we tagged fish in the Minto Flats in the summer. We tagged some of them in the Chatanika spawning area in the fall, and some in the Chatanika River spawning area in the fall. The unfortunate part about that project right now is I just got done with the broad whitefish not too long ago, and I have another project to write up, and I can't tell you a whole lot about that because I can't even remember where these fish popped up, because there was probably 130 tags, so I can't remember individuals. So apologize, I can't give you a whole lot more about that, but we hope to identify whether or not some of these ciscos in the Tanana spawning area are actually utilizing the Minto Flats, and that's one of the goals there. So, and I guess I could have gone to this slide. I couldn't remember my next slide, but it basically just reiterates what I just said. We tagged some fish here in the Minto Flats, some up here in the Chatanika spawning area, some in the Tanana spawning area. And we know fairly well that a lot of ciscos come up from the Minto Flats into the Chatanika spawning area. We just don't know if they're contributing to the Tanana spawning area. So that's what the study was going to look at. That was one aspect of it. Another interesting thing about that was when we sampled I wanted to see when they were coming into the spawning area up here. And I thought, well, maybe we'll check out in July and we'll do some sampling down there, and we'll take the radio telemetry receiver. And there was already fish, a lot of ciscos already up there. And we're talking around the pipeline crossing and just downstream of there for about maybe 8 river miles, which I thought was interesting. We're talking right before July 4th weekend. I was already catching, adult sized fish up there and some radio tagged fish on the receiver. So I'm not sure. I guess the question is, how much do they utilize the Chatanika River as for their whole life, as opposed to always going down the Minto Flats. Minto Flats, I'm sure, are still important though for those fish for rearing. Round whitefish. Well, I know even less about round whitefish, but this is a spawner that I caught in the Chatanika a few years ago, and they're mature again around 10, 12 inches, around age 4. They get up to, some of them get up to like 24 inches or so. They can live a long time, 10 to 30 years. I'm not sure where the 10-year, if didn't have time to look at the where these estimates of age at 10 years, but we used to do scales on a lot of fishes, and they're fairly unreliable for these. Well, they're quite unreliable for fish that live for a long time after they become mature. Anadromy for these fish, I do not know of it at all. I've never heard of whitefish being anadromous to any degree, but I wouldn't think any of the fish from the Minto Flats would be. They primarily eat benthic invertebrates, and in fact, they're mostly in the riverine habitat. I know they're around a little bit in the lakes and some of the streams that are around the lakes, the meandering streams, but they're more in the riparian flowing waters areas where you might find grayling. Humpback whitefish. This would be a little bit brief as well. They're mature around 14 inches in age 5, sometimes 6. Max size around 2 feet, roughly. They also eat benthic invertebrates. They live a long time, 10 to 30 years. There's some anadromy that's been indicated in some individuals. We found them spawning in the Chatanika and Tanana spawning areas, and we know from radio telemetry study from a grad student at UAF that some of those fish tied to Minto Flats went to the Tanana spawning area, and some went to the Chatanika spawning area. So we've had a spear fishery on humpback whitefish in the Chatanika. There's been we did a number of population estimates over time. In the 80s, you can see here we had estimates of in the 10 to 20,000 range for individuals. In 2007, roughly 20,000, and the last one we did was right around 14,000 or so in 2012. Harvest back in the 80s and the 90s at times was fairly high. You're looking at what, 5,000 tops out there. When we did some of these samples back in 97 and 96, you'll see the average size was fairly small, which might indicate and this is by proportion. So what this might indicate here is in the late 90s here that there was a fair bit of recruitment of fish in there. So if they're capturing, it's just a proportion. So there was just a large proportion of smaller fish, probably indicating good recruitment. We get in here into the 2012 and 2008, and we had the proportion of larger fish as dominating. And probably what's going on here is there's just not much recruitment. The Chatanika River spawning area is, I think works out well. What exactly the best parts of that spawning habitat are not exactly known, but one thing we do know is that the rearing habitat got to be quite good in Minto Flats. And in the 90s and early 2000s, we went through quite a drought in Minto Flats. It was just, you could barely fit through this particular channel here that we used to go sample up in quite a bit. And this is, I can't remember what year this picture, this is like 2009, I believe, or nope, 2010 for this particular picture. This picture is 2017. This is the same area. So you can see this spot right here is this spot here. And all of this is basically wide open, flooded wetlands now. So it's the return of the wetland. In fact, it was really amazing to watch this happen over the first couple of years that this happened. This started happening in, I believe 2014 was the first year that the but the flats flooded significantly in July, and then they remained flooded throughout the rest of that summer and early fall. And it's pretty much been that way every summer since then. And lots of willows and all the encroaching birch trees into the wetlands have all died. There's like a bathtub ring of all these dead trees. Anyways, this is not as good for rearing of juveniles, and I think this is a lot better. And we don't have a current abundance estimate, which I would like to get, but it's on my list of things to occur if funding will provide for it. But here's another picture of what it looks like when it's low and dry. We tried to get a boat through here, and it'll work. You just don't want to suck up weeds right before you get in there. But when it's flooded, it's just, there's water everywhere. And so I think what we saw there in the mid 90s and late 90s there, when we had that little bump in recruitment, was there had been some flooding in those early 90s where they had good recruitment of these juveniles. We get to 2008, 2012, juveniles have been dealing with this. There's just not as much good habitat for them. And right now, I suspect they're doing really well, including the pike. So we have the Chatanika whitefish spear fishery. It occurs from the Elliott Highway down to the pipeline. Most people spearfish right around here in the near the Elliott Highway Bridge and Olness Pond. This is, in fact, where these whitefish spawn. So the spear fishery is on spawning fish. The fishery became popular during the 80s. Harvest increased even to 25,000 fish per year by 1987. That's humpback whitefish, round whitefish, and least ciscos. You were not allowed to take sheefish. It had no bag limit until 1988 when we had a 15 fish bag limit implemented. But abundance continued to decline, and the fishery was closed by emergency order between 1994 and 2001. We reopened the fishery in 2007 by permit with a limit of 10 fish per household per permit. And we had an objective of total harvest of about 1,000 whitefish of any of those three species, the round, the humpback, and the least cisco. So the first year we issued 100 permits, only 52 households fished, and we had a total whitefish harvest of 267. Consequently, we bumped up the number of permits to 200 and did that for 8 years or so. And only in 1 year did we exceed that 1,000 fish limit. And then we bumped it up to 225 permits, and still we're not hitting 1,000 fish. And part of it, and I think one thing that's fairly consistent is, you're just getting a little over half of the permit holders actually going out to fish. The other thing that happened in some of these years between 2014 and 2021, there's been a lot of high water in the fall time that I think didn't lend itself to good fishing. I do notice that after talking to some of these permit holders, a lot of people, they get the permits, they want to go out. The reason half of them don't go out is they have another job that popped up, or they got a broken arm. There's just all kinds of things. So I am considering issuing a few more permits next year, maybe 250, just to allow the opportunity. Again, we haven't really hit the 1,000 fish harvest limit that we set. In addition, I hope to get an abundance estimate within the next 2 to 3 years on humpback whitefish and least ciscos. I think we'll see a bump up in the numbers of fish due to better recruitment down in Minto Flats. And that's what I had. Let me see. Did I turn off that? Are you still seeing the slideshow or no?
We just see your desktop now.
All right, stop share. There we go. Great. All right, so that was kind of a quick and dirty rundown of Minto Flats Whitefish. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Thanks, Andy. So I'll let people chime in, but just an initial question, kind of how did you capture the whitefish, and then how often did you track them once you had captured them? And then I'll let some other folks jump in.
Sure. Of the whitefish that we radio tagged, in Minto Flats, we would use gill nets, and you just set out one gill net, you sit there and you watch it for the corks, and as soon as you see it bounce, you grab it so you can grab the fish. You don't want the fish to sit in there long. That's how we captured them in the Minto Flats. In the Chatanika River and the Tanana River spawning areas, when we sampled there, we would use electrofishing. For the sheepfish was rod and reel and
Nice.
gill nets. Yeah.
For folks who don't know, the electrofishing, you kind of run power through the water, and the fish basically, it stimulates them. They come up to the surface and you can net them and catch them, right?
Yeah. Not as easy as it sounds, but yeah.
Anybody have any questions for Andy? I've got some, but I don't want to, steal everybody's thunder here.
Yeah, I've got a few questions. So I think you were talking about broad whitefish, but a couple, I guess humpback as well. You were talking about the two different spawning areas, one in Chatanika and one in the Tanana River. Do you think that those are two distinct populations? Has there been any research done on their genetics, or to see if those fish, if they're all from one mixed stock that just have two separate spawning areas, or if they're distinct?
I do not know. And I haven't, the only person that I would know, around here locally would be Andreas, if he's, I don't think that's been, I don't think he's looking at that or hasn't looked at that yet, or anybody else that I know of. Certainly we'd have to, I didn't collect any fin snips for that. I think on the sheepfish we did for Randy, as I recall. But yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that's unknown at this point.
Okay, and then the next question, I was up in Minto this fall, and we saw a subsistence harvester with a gill net pulling quite a few fish out to feed this sled dog team. And I'm just curious if you think if there's any effect from that fishery or any of the fisheries really in the Minto Flats area, whether there's any indication of decreasing abundance or shrinking size from gill net harvest, or anything like that.
I think there's always the potential for some reduction in abundance. But the size, I think size is usually the one that usually, gill nets are fairly selective, and even anglers when they're rod and reel fishing will be selective. Granted, there's sport fish harvest is regulated to the extent of one fish over 30 inches on northern pike. But as far as subsistence, they get the permit and whatever they catch in their nets, and then with those nets, I think depending on what size they've got, they're going to target larger fish potentially. I'm not sure how many people are actually out there gill netting for subsistence, how many permits. I'm not, Commercial Fish Division handles that, and I don't actually have the number in front of me right now. I do know that there was a harvest, I think, of 1,500 northern pike in the winter ice fishery, that portion of the subsistence fishery, and then the total harvest last year was a little over 3,000 northern pike. So I would assume that was some of the netting that you're talking about. As far as monitoring the population, they get those to see if the population's been affected. There's just not enough there's not enough population assessments before and after to make an evaluation at this time.
I was out there with Will and checked out the net, and it was a lot of like really big broad whitefish the folks are bringing in, which I've never been able to catch a broad whitefish on rod and reel. They're almost impossible to catch. So I think they're
Yeah.
mainly catching them, and a few sheefish and pike and humpbacks and fleeces and that sort of thing. But
Which area of the flats were you in?
that was just right off the boat launch at the Minto Village.
Okay, yeah. There's always a net or two there.
Yeah, I think it's the school teacher there in Minto.
Yeah,
In the past that he puts out his net there right off the launch. But
yeah. I think he's their number one gill netter.
so I had a question. Did any of the Lee Cisco go up into the Yukon Flats, or did you have any evidence of that?
No. I think we only did one survey up there because it was simultaneous to the broad whitefish for 1 year, and I think we got one survey up there for the Lee Ciscos. But the Lee Ciscos were kind of limited in funds, and the total area that these fish could go is basically the whole Yukon drainage. And at some point, we can only we just trimmed the flights down to our primary questions, which was Minto Flats and the Tanana spawning area. For the broad whitefish, I flew up to Lake Minchumina in the summer and the Chatanika River and a few of those other off-channel things, the Fish Creek and Fish Lake down in the lower Tanana. But we only did those flights like once or twice. It was just limited funds. We focused on the primary areas and tried to get it like once or twice on both species.
Did you notice anything about like their winter habitats for the whitefish and the lower Tanana? Do they like seek out deep pools or areas where there's open leads, or any kind of patterns with where they were hanging out in the winter?
I didn't detect any open leads. As far as the depth of the water, I have no clue what it was. I kind of assume they pick out areas that a lot of other fish do in the winter is, reduction in current, reduce the amount of swimming they have to do. On the Tanana, there's, as you get downstream of Fairbanks, there's some of these smaller side channels, and some would have a little bit of overflow or maybe an open lead here and there. But typically, as I recall, there was, granted, you're in an airplane, how precise can you be? But they always seem to be more in the biggest, largest main channel rather than those off channels. That's probably about as close as I can get to their habitat selection in the winter.
Always wanted to try to find like an overwintering group of them and try to ice fish for them, but they seem pretty cryptic.
Yeah. I don't know what they would, with grayling, I find that, what they're eating is not moving. And then so after all winter, they're not even used to seeing food. They don't bite very hard, and they bite very little for a grayling. They don't go very far, but I have caught them in the right areas. When you get on top of them, you can. But so I suspect the whitefish would be, to a similar degree, would be difficult to capture.
Andy, this is Fred. Did you find specific areas and kind of to build on that same question that you were just asked about overwintering areas? Were there places where fish seem to congregate in the winter?
Yeah.
And did that happen year on year?
Yeah, that the main spot that kind of seemed to have a congregation of overwintering fish, if I were to pick one, if I could pick any of them, I can only really pick out one that kind of stands out, and that's just downstream of Fairbanks. Those broad whitefish were, after they got done spawning, there was a fair number that would overwinter in Gosh, I wonder if I can bring it up. Let me see. Let's see if we can get there. Are you seeing the screen?
No.
Yeah.
Let me get the share. I'll get to the spot anyways first. Let's see, share screen. Share. Okay, there we go. Okay, now you can see it maybe.
Yep.
So the airport's like right around here, but this particular stretch right here where I'm doing my cursor, that was kind of all 3 years that we did surveys, there was always fish like in this little stretch here. Everything else was just kind of sprinkled about. I mean, that was probably the densest spot for overwintering, I thought.
And that was multiple species?
That was the broad whitefish. I don't have anything on the least ciscos right now. And the she fish, the tides turned off in the winter.
What about the humpbacks?
I'm not sure. That was Aaron Dupuis' study, and I'm pretty sure they turned off in the winter as well. Yeah, actually, here's my winter's locations. But yeah, this stretch right here was just downstream of the Fairbanks. You know, some of these, I'm not, you got to remember these is a couple years laid on top of each other, but I always remember this spot here being kind of the most consistent for having broad whitefish there. Yeah, sorry about the other species. There's just, like I say, there's this lack of information on some of them. I just don't think the radio tags were operational for Aaron and in the winter, as I recall. And I know for sure the sheefish tags were not operational in the winter.
It's all just really cool information because we don't know a lot about what these whitefish do because they're kind of, a less loved species more or less compared to everything or salmon. So.
I think maybe, like the thing that's, one of the main things, and it started with, there were some indications that there were spawning areas up here, but like Aaron Dupuis' radio telemetry study occurred like in 2008, and he had some missing fish, and they went over here where they, there's a sort of a suspected spawning area, and lo and behold, his tides showed up here in this whitefish spawning area. And then as we've done more sampling there and put out more radio tags, it's pretty significant area, and it's a very unique, like tight area. It doesn't really go beyond, certainly not beyond Eielson Air Force Base. I'm trying to remember the upper limit. It seemed like it was a little bit upstream of Moose Creek Dam. You could still catch some fish, whether you're electrofishing or the radio tides. And it really doesn't go downstream of the dump, as far as I can tell, as far as fish holding and looking like they're ready to spawn. So it's somewhere in that general vicinity right there. And it really is pretty significant. There are large numbers of humpback whitefish, least ciscos, sheefish, broad whitefish out there. And who would have thought that was, when you think about how Fairbanks got founded, the guy that wanted to set up shop with all his wares, hired the steamship to come up to go to Tanacross and got stopped at what they call Bates Falls here. I don't know why they call it a falls, but basically riverboats can go upstream of that spot. And obviously he went up the Chena River and got dropped off. But this is the spot that he couldn't get through is where the whitefish spawn. And it's been there for who knows how long. I'm sure hundreds of years or thousands of years.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So what about that? So what about that spot makes it good spawning habitat for whitefish? So like, what are the characteristics of that?
It's suspected that kind of like the Yukon Flats, that when it pans out in this multi-channel area, that there are sort of like heads to a dam, but the water can percolate through the gravels and then it comes out downstream, and where it comes out downstream, that it's giving consistent temperature and aeration to the eggs. That's Yeah, that's the common component for several salmon spawning and whitefish spawning areas in the river here. So as well as the Yukon Flats.
So it's just a section of the river where there's gravel on the bottom, whereas most of the rest of the Tanana River tends to be more silty, like sedimented bottom.
No, there's lots of gravel throughout I mean, when you go throughout the whole canal here, I mean, if you get out when there's flowing water, there's gravels. The difference up here is, you go from kind of almost a singular channel to a very wide, like multi-channel area. And then and every one of these channels kind of hits like little bars where it kind of dams up the water behind it. And then the gravels are permeable, so the water can flow through the gravels. And then as it drops off the backside there, you get a lot of water percolating up. And so if you fly over this area in the winter, there's a lot of open leads and open water areas. And so the water is, you get basically kind of moderated water as it comes out of the gravels and out of the ground there. It's has relatively warm water that is, rather than being like at zero, it's, whatever, even if it's a half degree, it's a little bit warmer and it percolates up through there, and it provides a better bath for the eggs, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I was always under the assumption that the she-fish that you found like in the chat in the fall, that I was under the assumption that those things were up there eating eating the rounds and eating the other fish. So the she-fish are actually up there that spawn too?
Yep,
Huh.
that is correct. Yeah.
So that was kind of a false assumption to think that they were there eating stuff.
Yeah. No, they're up there to do to spawn. Yep.
But so how do they spawn? I mean, are they like, because the she-fish or you see the whitefish up there doing their thing, and there's groups of them, at the surface of the water and such, but like, it never seems like you see enough she-fish to actually do such a thing.
Yeah, there's, you're talking like, up to 40,000 least ciscos and 10 to 20,000 humpback whitefish and maybe 1,500 she-fish. So you're going to see humpbacks and you're going to see least ciscos. Plus the timing of their spawning is slightly different. So maybe that's another element to not seeing them in the water there as much when you're spearfishing.
Yeah. So is there like with salmon, there's a progression because they all use the stream in a different manner or whatever. So with these whitefish that come in, is there a progression of like first the rounds come in, then the ciscos, then the humps, then the she-fish, or do you know anything about that?
They're all kind of rough. They kind of overlap a little bit, but there are some like, she-fish a little bit earlier and ciscos and then humpback. And then I think the round whitefish are nearly the last. Browed whitefish are late. They're later yet. And so yeah, some, and across, basically from mid-September till the end of October up there. But most of the time, even, let's see here, I was just thinking this last year and the last couple of years we were out there, a lot of those fish, like from the Elliott Highway Bridge, when they come up there, they spawn and then they start to meander downstream a little bit. And it's not all at once. There's a number of fish that go up there and spawn, and there's another group that are behind them that aren't ready yet. And then they start to come up there and spawn. That group that's done goes downstream, and you kind of work your way through all these fish. And by mid-October, at least the first few miles downstream of the bridge is usually totally vacated of these whitefish, humpies, ciscos, and she-fish.
So I know that like there was one kid that was real active in Midnight Sun. It was Lars Rosenblad, and he goes up there in the fall, and I know he's had times where he's caught like a dozen whitefish on a fly rod. And so I think is that something that may develop? I mean, seems like as we run short of opportunities with other fish, we always have to turn our, like as a kid, now carp's a big thing back where I came from, people actually try and catch carp. And so are we going to be catching whitefish here soon? And what's the deal is, can you actually catch whitefish on a fly rod? And if you were to target it at that time, fish like a tiny, tiny, tiny bead, or would you still be trying to fish? Are they feeding when they're spawning? And do they feed off of the other fish spawn that's in the gravel?
There's some yeses in there and some nos. I'll try to remember all of it, but when they're spawning, they're primarily worried about spawning. Do they sometimes eat and bite? Yeah, they do, but I find most spawning fish are not quite as aggressive to like actual feeding. They may be more aggressive about defending territory. That said, I mean, yeah, some of those fish are eating the eggs as, once they're done, they may eat some of the eggs. I can tell you the grayling are in there eating the eggs. They get really rotund bellies. I mean, they're just full of eggs. The round whitefish are eating eggs because I think they spawn a little bit later. And so they're getting ready to spawn, but they're hanging out there. As far as is fishing for whitefish going to become a thing? That's kind of up to you. I mean, I really don't have any, I don't go out there and fly fish for them. So I don't really have any recommendations for you of any stretch, but, I do know they'll eat the least ciscos. If you get the nice little micro jigs, I know some people that catch them with that, and I'm sure just little flies that look like, little darting zooplankton. You can probably pick them up. I mean, I think should be a fun challenge to figure it out. And
So
why not?
like, whenever when we fish the outlet of Paxson, I know I'm not very good at it, but Fred can sit there and catch 30 whitefish in a row. One after the other. And is that why can you do that there and not do that sort of thing in the Chatanika? Or do you think that, if you can do it at the outlet of Paxson, then why can't you do it in the Chatanika?
Sure. I mean, they're there in July. So they're not spawning then. And they shouldn't be that geared up to spawn that they won't eat. I suppose just getting in the right place, right time, using the right equipment, the right fly. I think it would certainly be worth your time to try that out. I know, I have a friend of mine that's fished there for at least ciscos, right? Like in July and early August before they're spawning, and caught them with these like little micro jigs on his spinning rod, or maybe it was fly rod. I can't remember which, but so they're there, they'll eat. It's just a matter of probably putting in the time and effort to figure it out, I would imagine.
I think for me, like the round whitefish and humpbacks, I've had success in the spring where they seem to kind of follow the grayling into the sloughs and along the Chena, and when the grayling are spawning, and you can kind of use like little San Juan worms or little nymphs and pick up those whitefish when they're concentrated.
Yeah, this is Fred. I can say a little bit of the little whitefish fishing that I've done with success. Like Jim said, the outlet of Paxson, but that was using midges, and really thin leaders and getting them right on the bottom and just, nymphing for them. And you could catch them sometimes fairly consistently, sometimes not. But I've also caught mostly humpbacks, I think. I don't know that I've ever caught anything else up on the Kobuk, and they're getting ready to spawn. When you're up there fishing for she-fish, there are lots of humpback whitefish around. And again, you could catch them on nymphs, but bigger sized, say size 10, 12 or 12 mayfly larvae type nymph. I don't know if they're doing a lot of drift feeding as they get ready to spawn, but they will take a nymph. But I did have a question, Andy. You threw out the number 1,500 she-fish. Was that based on any data? Because I remember that Fish and Game ran a weir up there for a few years in the late 60s, and their numbers were more like 110 that they actually documented in those days? If there are 1,500 now, it's a big difference.
No, Fred, you caught me in a lie. I was just, I was just throwing out a number, not really. I couldn't, I just
Yeah,
couldn't
okay, I
remember
was
what it
just
was.
wondering where that came from.
But
because
more
I've
of a
been-
just like a relative, just so you have an idea, relatively, it's like there's usually a lot of Cisco's.
Yeah, and not very darn many sheefish, but
Yeah.
Jim, they do spawn in the same sort of manner. They broadcast spawn, they splash around on the surface and do that in a group.
Yeah. And that, as far as that weir went, Fred, that thing just did not pan out.
I think
Well, I'm not sure we're talking about the same weir.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. There was one put on the Chatanika like in the 80s.
No, this is the 60s.
Oh, the 60s. Weir. Oh, yeah, yeah.
68, 69.
Okay, yeah.
And all
Okay,
he's on
I remember that
too,
one
but I'm
too.
not sure he knows how to talk on the thing, but he could.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I do vaguely remember that one too. And I do remember there's some number of like 150, we know
yeah,
it's
there
a
weren't
small
very many.
number,
I mean,
you
the
know,
bottom line, it was a small number.
yeah, it's just, you're just not going to see that many. I mean, just from us sampling, if we go electrofishing in there, we don't see that many of them.
I think we're in rarefied company here. I think Evan, Deanna, and Jeff Adams have all caught sheefish in the Toll of Honor, Chatanika. So that's a pretty hard thing to do these days.
Yeah, I've only ever caught one, and it was down by the lower boat launch in the spring. I know, I think like Lars, the friend of mine that my dad was talking about earlier, the last few years has gone out and made a concerted effort the last, I think, 3 seasons to try to catch them in the chat, in the spawning area in the fall. And I think he's caught 2 or 3 in the last 3 seasons. He's also, the other interesting thing though is he's had, I've been out with him a little bit, and the Cisco's seem to be like the only thing that we've been able to catch consistently, at least on a fly rod. But what he's had the most luck with for the humpback whitefish is like a larger, like 1.5 to sometimes like 2-inch white tube jigger, Mr. Twister. Like bouncing it all like all along the bottom and dragging it like right in front of their noses when they're sitting in a hole. Almost more like getting some sort of like a reaction or like an aggressive take instead of like a feeding response.
That's interesting. That's cool. You've caught the Cisco. I've never caught a least Cisco on the fly, just humpbacks and rounds. Andy, is there much sheefish bycatch on the spear fishery on the Chatanika?
There may be some. I just, obviously nobody reports it, or they report an unknown fish. The permit comes with a description of each fish species out there that you can spear, as well as the ones you're not supposed to spear, and it comes with a nice picture of it. Hopefully everybody's with the program and will adhere to that. I haven't heard of anybody being caught with one, but anything's possible. Let's put it that way, right? But
Kevin, I've done that spear fishery a few times, and the sheefish, it seems like they hang out quite a bit further out than the round whitefish and the Cisco and the humpbacks. The humpbacks seem to hang out a little further out too in the deeper water. It's harder to spear them, I think. But the sheefish, I've seen a few, and they sure scare the crap out of you when you're looking at these little fish swimming by, and then a 3-foot fish comes right in your face. But normally they're in the deeper water, and it'd be pretty tough to spear them even if you were trying, in my experience.
That makes sense. What about grayling? Do many people accidentally spear grayling?
I've only ever I almost speared one once, but I saw the fin, but I don't see very many. It's not like they're necessarily intermixing, I don't think, with the whitefish. So I don't know. I'm sure that happens more often because they look very similar size.
All right. Any other questions for Andy? Somebody said in the chat, yes, Kevin, grayling definitely do. I know people that have been busted for it. That'd be unfortunate. Well, it's good to know. All right, well, so one last call for questions here, and then we'll kind of close things out.
Why do the broadfish, why don't they go up to Chatanika? Because
Yeah,
they're
good
really,
question.
they're really good eating and although you can't catch them, but they're,
Yeah. I'm not sure. They don't, to the best of my knowledge, they're not up to Salakna. I'm not quite sure. I'm not that versed on what their spawning requirements are, but you think they would be up there. But
just bigger water. They go to places with bigger water.
It's hard to say. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I'd have to look because they have a fairly wide distribution. So I'd have to look at some other projects in other areas just to see if they're rather specific to large rivers. Offhand, I just don't know. I'd have to dig that up. If anybody else knows, Fred, maybe you can chime in on that one, but
it just seems like whitefish do very strange, unpredictable things compared to salmon and other species. Like, why do whitefish prefer these few areas and certain rivers to spawn when salmon go up every river or many rivers,
Yeah, and where the whitefish spawning in Paxton Lake.
Yeah, speaking of that, which species are you catching in Paxton, Jim and Fred?
Mainly humpbacks.
But I know we've got Cisco's, humpbacks, and I think even rounds, but it seems like you get into schools of fish. They're all sort of laying there feeding on whatever they're feeding on that's going by.
I need to go with you guys so I can finally knock the least Cisco off my list. I've never caught a least Cisco on a fly.
Are you guys fishing out of a boat or offshore for those?
No, just from shore.
Okay.
Fred won't let us eat grayling because he's in love with grayling, so we end up having to always eat whitefish.
Yeah, they're pretty tasty though, Jim.
Yeah, grayling are not as good as whitefish, in my opinion.
Yeah, whitefish are delicious. So
I'll have to prepare one for you. Might change.
I'd rather eat whitefish. They're good.
Really? Wow. I think they're good fresh. The people say when they get frozen or whatever, they just kind of degrade a little bit more than other fish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
All right, guys. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll probably close it out and let Andy head home. Looks like he's still at work. So I really appreciate you talking with us, Andy. It's been a pleasure and learned a lot today, and really cool to learn about these fish we don't know much about. So
Yeah. Well, I hope you learned a few things. I'm sorry I kind of slammed it together. It's not the most intricate study design or just presentation there, but it's kind of an overview, but hopefully learned something. So
I think that's the best kind of talk is just a discussion more than a canned presentation. So we appreciate it.
good. Right on. Have a good night.
yeah, that one of the interesting thing is, boy, if there's only 150 of those things, those she fish, then you're almost at numbers that could go with one catastrophic event could go to extinction within that small pool of fish. So I was like, wow, that's not that many fish. And the other thing is I had no idea that there were those round humpfish or whitefish. So that was really cool. Yeah, cool information. Thank you. Appreciate it.
One thing that'll make you feel a little bit better is that she fish and most of the other whitefishes, not every fish will spawn each year. So out of a pop, let's say there's 500, maybe 150 go up there to spawn. The other guys are like, we're not ready to spawn this year.
Yeah, Evan and I ate one year and Fred guilted us by telling us we ate like 5% of the population of the Chatanika River. So,
Just, yeah, well, you know, some of them go spawn in the Yukon, so depending on where you caught it, you know. You caught it in the Tanana.
It's pretty cool that some of them go all the way to the ocean. That's a long ways.
Yeah. Well, they do it in the Yukon Flats as well, and I'm sure the other populations do as well. They're just, you know, these big rivers, once, you know, these fish spawn in the fall. The eggs, when they hatch and come out of the gravels, they're, you know, we're talking spring freshet, and they go downriver. And, you know, you can imagine the Chatanika River, they wash into the Minto Flats, and it's a great spot. But some of these other ones in the Tanana, they're just, who knows where they're going to pull out. But some are probably washing all the way down to the mouth of the Yukon. So if they can persist down there, they're gonna live well down there too.
All right, guys. Well, we'll let Andy go here. Thanks again, Andy, and appreciate you all tuning in.
Thanks. You're welcome.
Yeah,
Bye,
thanks, Andy. Bye.
You're welcome. Yep.
thanks, Andy. Thanks, Kevin, for putting together.
Station.